Well, that's getting connected. If everybody wouldn't mind, if you wouldn't mind turning off your videos, that'd be terrific. So let me introduce myself. Welcome, everybody. My name is Krista Dillabaugh, and I'm the director of the Morpho Institute. And we offer these monthly Amazon Conservation Through Education webinars. If you're not already signed up for our newsletter to get updates, you can visit our website and do that. And I'll provide the link for that at the end of the presentation tonight with Dr. Dave Pearson. So let me just tell you a little bit about Dave. We've worked with Dave for many years. And tonight's presentation is obviously about biodiversity and saving species when we have very little time left. Dave is a professor at Arizona State University. His background is broad as well as deep. We know Dave through his role as faculty on some of our programs, and his deep love of ecology and conservation and ecotourism and blending those three. Also the sustainable use of biodiversity. He's a tiger beetle expert. I think we could safely say maybe the world's leading expert on tiger beetles, and also a very avid ornithologist. On top of all of that, he's an incredible teacher and educator. He's not just a research professor. He is dedicated to teachers and teaching and students, and has just been a real valuable asset and friend to our program. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dave and let him share his screen. And we will sit back and relax and interact with Dave. And please use that chat box to ask your questions.
Okay, well, it's fun to be back here and share some of these ideas. There are going to be some controversial things. None of this is set in stone. There are, as I said, a lot of controversy about this approach. So have at it with questions, or if there are things you think shouldn't be said or should be said that weren't said, go ahead and speak up with the chat box. Also, it's kind of fun to approach your students with this kind of controversial idea that we don't know everything. There's a lot of things that we're trying, and we're going to make some mistakes. The approach also in conservation is more and more controversial, in that it's approaching this idea of economics, the fact that there are costs and benefits. Not all species are equal. Some species may be more worth saving than others. That's a real hard one to get around. And the fact that this whole approach to conservation is taking on more and more of a business-like approach, cost and benefits. Understanding that, seeing what you can think about that, and approaching your students with the idea that they too can have some input, and that, again, this is not something that is absolute, but these are ideas that we're trying to see what we can do with so little time and so many species. So the idea here is to look at, can we save more species by focusing on only a few, and see how that works out. It's not enough to know that a species is rare, like this Kirtland's warbler. It only nests in a little part of the northern part of the South Peninsula of Michigan. That's this entire nesting area. There's a few nests in Wisconsin and Ontario, but by and large, about 4,500 individuals nest in this tiny little area, and they only nest in a specialized habitat of jack pine forest. So there we know, and its population is going down. That's not enough. We cannot conserve a species if we only know where it occurs and it's getting rarer. It is not enough. We have to know why if we're going to manage this, and we're going to conserve these for long periods. And the Kirtland's warbler is a good example of how much information we need to actually manage the conservation program needed to keep this species going. We now know it's a specialist in jack pine forest and nests on the ground underneath the jack pines. But if the jack pines get too old or too mature, it won't nest there. It needs fairly young jack pine forest. So they had to decide, well, we now know we need to manage this forest, and use fires to keep the forest from getting too old, keeping it a young forest so that Kirtland's warblers could continue to nest there. For whatever reasons, the Kirtland warblers are so specialized on only young jack pine forest. We don't know that answer yet, why it is. Turns out that wasn't enough. The population was still going down. Then they looked at more details, and they discovered the brown-headed cowbirds had moved in. These jack pine forests, years and decades and hundreds of thousands of years ago, weren't surrounded by open fields. Brown-headed cowbirds couldn't move in. So the Kirtland's warbler has had no time to evolve, as other warblers and other birds have, defenses against the cowbird. And the defense is the brown-headed cowbird doesn't make its own nest. It comes in, lays its eggs in the nest of the Kirtland's warbler, and the Kirtland's warbler then takes them on as orphans and raises those young birds up. And its own young often die because the cowbirds grow faster. So the next management that they discovered to keep the Kirtland's warbler's populations from declining is, wow, we've got to get rid of the brown-headed cowbirds. So they started trapping out the brown-headed cowbirds locally. Population still kept going down. Again, the management needed a lot more details. And it turns out it is never enough, especially in dealing with a migratory bird, to know what's going on where it nests, because it also has a migration route and it has wintering grounds down in the Bahamas. We didn't know for years where it wintered, and only recently are we getting an idea where it winters. And we think mostly in the Bahamas, maybe Cuba, maybe in South Florida, and we don't even have a good idea where within these wintering grounds what kind of habitat it occupies. We thought it was young pine forest like it nests in, but it's not. Apparently it's brushy areas. Again, we're learning more and more details, but think about the amount of work, the amount of details that we have needed to try and adequately manage this species. It's incredible. We don't have that information for most species, and certainly for most threatened and endangered species, we don't have near this amount of information. Do we have the time? What can we do to make some shortcuts that can get around this problems of having to wait years and years for adequate data to be able to manage the habitat and protect these species adequately? Here's just a kind of an idea of how complicated both the political, the actual biological data, we're talking about all these different management programs, legislation, different ways. All these things have to be coordinated for defense and protection. It isn't a simple thing. You can't just set aside an area and say, here, this is protected. This is just some idea of how complicated it is. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and often a lot of money. So how can we manage conservation areas if we don't know why the species or habitat is threatened for most of them? One thing that's coming up now is the future of conservation may well depend on a few of the more well-studied species we call surrogate species. These are the ones that are stand-in species that in some ways we know enough about them, or it's easy enough to get the data. If we protect them, we can have an idea of how to maybe conserve other species that are not so well known. So the whole idea now revolves around this idea of these surrogate species. Now, there are different types of surrogate species, and these are classified in numerous ways. This is probably these five are the most common ones: umbrella species, keystone species, flagship species, sentinel species, indicator species. Let's look at some of the details on maybe what's a way that we can use these to replace all the data that are needed for the other species that are in such danger. Indicating, again, this whole idea that maybe some species are more valuable than other species, which is a very hard idea for some people to wrap their minds around. Umbrella species, like this jaguar right here. What are the details we need to know about an umbrella species? By protecting these species, you are going to be automatically protecting a lot of other species that occur in the same habitat. And that means that you usually want to choose an umbrella species that has a very large territory, so that when you, whatever it is that you need to do to protect the jaguar or some other umbrella species, it's going to be a large enough area that's going to incorporate protection for a lot of other species also. Things like large body size, colorful, otherwise obvious, those are basic necessities for an umbrella species to be used. And it has to be well known, it has to have its biology and natural history well known, so that we know what to do to at least protect it. A jaguar needs hundreds of square kilometers of protection. We know we can't just get a 10 square kilometer area that's going to protect the jaguar. It won't work. We have to know enough about its natural history to know that we're at least going to, by protecting it adequately, keeping its population grow, that will also incorporate, without even our knowing which species are there, a lot of other species are going to be protected under this umbrella. Some examples of other umbrella species are northern right whale, some macaws, the Eurasian bison, some fish, some salmon, other coho salmon, things like that. These have all been proposed as species for which we have plenty of data to know what it is we need to protect them. They occur over fairly large areas. They meet those criteria. And by protecting them, we are automatically protecting a lot of other species. Many of them are also in danger or threatened. Some we aren't even aware are there and need protection. Then we have another group of surrogates we can call flagship species. And you all look at the, you've all seen the panda being used over and over again by World Wildlife Fund as its mascot or as a symbol. And a flagship species is a different type of surrogate, has different types of necessities. Some overlap with the umbrella species, but they are in many ways quite different. They have to capture the imagination of the public, being charismatic, having big brown eyes, young that are very cute, things that are going to attract people who don't know a lot about natural history. These are the types of things that will attract people who are not biologists and scientists. In essence, the flagship species acts as an ambassador, an icon or a symbol for a defined habitat. In some ways, overlapping what we see in the umbrella species, but they are very, very much more involved with stimulating conservation awareness. And probably the most important factor involved with flagship species, induce people to donate funds. That's a big part. So again, we're getting some overlap with umbrella species, but also some differences on the types of surrogate species here that are going to be used, a few species that are going to be used to represent and protect large numbers of habitats that would otherwise be protected. Some other examples of flagship species include things like the manatee, the koala, some of the flamingos, pangolin, hawksbill sea turtles, even some insects like this very large butterfly we find in Australia. Again, they meet the criteria. They can capture the attention of people who weren't otherwise going to be super interested in a lot of the other species that are around. They can be cute, as you see the koala, but those are the kind of examples we see in flagship species. Again, a few species, concentrating on them, getting to know a lot about them and using them to protect other species. Then we have things like keystone species. Now this gets a little more biological. This happens to be a Gila woodpecker we have here in Arizona. So it nests in saguaros, and saguaros don't have holes in them like that. The woodpeckers are the ones that make those holes. And they are one of the only species that can make the holes in a saguaro cactus. And there are a lot of other desert nesting species that nest in cavities but cannot make their own holes. Guess what? They depend on the Gila woodpecker. So we have ash-footed flycatchers, we have pygmy owls, we have elf owls, we have purple martins. We have a whole array of birds and some mammals who couldn't be in the desert if it weren't for the Gila woodpecker. This woodpecker is more important than a lot of other species. It has a disproportionate effect on its environment compared to its relative abundance. It maintains the structure of an ecological community affecting many other species. So again, we have this whole idea that can be very controversial and sometimes hard to accept. Not all species have the same equality as far as their value to the environment. Some species are much more important than other species, and these keystone species are an example. Of course, again, their biology and natural history has to be really well known to be able to have an effective way. So by concentrating, protecting the Gila woodpecker, you're automatically protecting 10 or 15 other species that would not be able to survive in this habitat if it weren't for the Gila woodpecker. Now, another example that's a little bit more complicated, and it doesn't really make a logical sense at first. A top predator is a keystone species. The presence of this top predator actually allows more species to occur in the community. You'd think just the opposite. The top predator would be wiping out all the other species that it preys on. But this starfish in its intertidal zones off the coast of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California is a major keystone species and one of the first ones that was studied. And it turns out what it does is it ends up eating a lot of the other mollusks around, mussels and limpets and barnacles. And it doesn't choose very carefully. It just eats everything in its path. What happens if you remove the sea star, and this was done experimentally, where large areas where the sea stars were taken away for several years, what happens is the number of species of mollusks falls from 15 to 8. And that's because the sea star now has been taken away, and the dominant competitors that are competing for the space on the rocks, that's the limiting resource, is the space on the rocks. All of a sudden, the few dominant, the 8 dominant competitors take over completely. And they reduce the space available for the competitors that are not quite as good as keeping up. So the presence of a predator actually enables this habitat to maintain more species. It's a very valuable keystone species. Then there are things like sentinel species. And those are, in many ways, the word sentinel is appropriate, and that they are a way for us to see something going on with the habitat long before we would otherwise recognize it going on. When the brown pelican started dying, or the peregrine falcon started dying back in the 1960s, it told us something's going on. It turns out it was DDT. Sentinel species here, and we have an example of the coral bleaching, in which the coral are giving up, or for some reason the little algae that live inside them that actually provide a lot of food are being eliminated. And the coral turns white and dies. It can be caused by change in pH, several other problems, pollution. Excuse me. The sentinel species, we have to have what we call a very stable taxonomy. That they aren't constantly splitting and lumping species, so that we know who we're working with, which species we're working with. It's very, very important. And again, as we've seen over and over again, these are species we need to know really in detail what's going on, so that when we see problems, we know why those problems are going on. They also need to be easily observed and manipulated. They can't be doing these things in a hidden or difficult way. It just makes them very difficult to be adequate sentinel species. And as you might guess, the more specialized they are and susceptible to slight changes in habitat and to pollutants, the more effective they're going to be in telling us something's going wrong with the habitat. And because that goes, and this is another thing that we're going to see more and more important in these different types of surrogate species, their importance economically. It turns out that there's a lot of people who actually make the decisions, like senators and legislators and politicians, who are not conservationists, who are not really excited about doing something that's going to cut back on funding or for other areas by giving funding for environment, unless they can see, oh, this is an investment in the future. We have to start talking about, in a business point of view, cost and profits, as much as we might not like to. So by having a very sensitive species changing very, very quickly, so it's very obvious that something's going on, we can catch it early. And we can do something about that by knowing exactly what's happening and save a lot of other species that are not the sentinel species themselves. Again, a surrogate standing in for other species, making it very, very important. Some other examples that we've been seeing right now, we're using them more and more often here in the United States, is monitoring pollutants in wastewater treatment facilities. If you go to a wastewater treatment facility and there's lots of midges flying around and dragonflies flying around, you know they're taking good care of that water. That water is being treated very, very effectively. If you go there the next week and all of a sudden there are no midges, there's no dragonflies, that can tell you something's happened very, very quickly. And I'm working with some wastewater treatment facilities right here in Arizona. And I can tell you right now that the managers are very, very much into looking at these things like insects and other crustaceans. And they really like seeing them there because they know that they're getting the job done when they're there. And when they disappear, they can right away look at and say, what's happened? Have we introduced something? Is our pH off? Has there a chemical come in that we didn't know about? Again, these are the sentinel species that really help us a lot. And the way this helps other species is these wastewater treatment facilities, especially in dry areas like here in Arizona, are a major wintering area for a lot of waterfowl and other birds. I just did a bird survey 2 days ago, and in 3 hours, I had 80 species of birds around these wastewater treatment facilities at one place. It's amazing how many birds winter here and use these facilities. You don't want to have these facilities all of a sudden changing their pH or a chemical coming in and seeing lots and lots of dead ducks floating in the water. That's not appropriate either. So again, these insects can be very, very important as sentinel species, protecting a lot of other species. Then we have a broad category. These are indicator species, mainly dealing with species richness and looking at entire areas, large areas, and looking at the whole idea of species diversity itself and how it might be impacted, and how we can use a few species amongst these to better protect a large number of other species in a large area. Again, we need to make sure that their taxonomy is really stable, that all of a sudden we're not spending 5 years studying a species and all of a sudden we find, oh no, this is not one species, this is actually 5 different species. Our data are not going to be real useful. So we need to have a real stable taxonomy that way. And there's not a lot of species or groups of species that have that kind of stable taxonomy worldwide. Again, over and over again, they need to have their biology and natural history well known. Another one we've seen in several of the other indicator species, they need to be easily observed and manipulated. That's really important because that's the way in which we can get to problems, questions, and answers to the questions very, very quickly when time is usually of great essence. It's also important that there are in these groups that we work with, these indicator species of families or genera or groups of species, that they have different species that occur over many types of habitats throughout the world. And they also are correlated with the patterns we see in other species that are harder to see, harder to understand. Again, being good surrogates as indicating what happens to these species is a good way to look at and predict what's going to happen to other species. And economic importance for politicians, especially for the decision makers. Unfortunately, most biology teachers, most bird watchers, most butterfly collectors don't make those conservation decisions. They can supply evidence, but who finally makes the policy are these non-conservationists, these politicians and legislatures that are so important to be able to speak to them in a language they can understand. That's something we have to learn how to do. So let's look at some of the more details for especially indicator species, but this will apply to all the other surrogates we've talked about too. This whole idea of a stable taxonomy. How many groups of organisms, plants and animals, are stable? It's with DNA and molecular studies now, we're finding these things called cryptic species. We thought was one species, we're actually 3 or 4 species. Things are getting more complicated, so we have to be careful.
Yeah, I will. I'll take some cashews and some fruit and.
Nicole wants some cashews, okay? At any rate, so the stable taxonomy is really important. And how many groups of organisms around the world have got a taxonomy that's relatively stable? Well, as you might guess, the bird watchers have really had a big impact. The ornithologists have been far in advance in looking at all kinds of different characters to make sure we know what a species is, that there aren't hidden species in amongst them. So again, I'll go through some of these. There are other examples. Birds are certainly right at the top of the list of a group of organisms that seem to meet that first criterion very, very readily. Amazingly enough, frogs in tropical forests, in temperate areas. Amphibians are extremely well known and have had a lot of their taxonomic work done on them and have a relatively stable taxonomy as well. It's not one you would think of automatically as meeting that criterion. There are orchids, there are other groups of plants, and lo and behold, there are things like tiger beetles. For instance, here in North America, we've got it down so we even have a subspecies. We have field guides. We're working on all kinds of details. And we can go on, this will come up over and over again. I'm not saying tiger beetles are the only one, but they're an example, an extreme example of a group of organisms that's really been well worked over. Biology, distribution, and natural history. So it's not enough to know the names. The taxonomy by itself is not enough. You need to know a lot about why they are, where they are, what they do, their annual cycle, where they nest, how they mate, who are their enemies, what their food is. We need to know all those details in intimate detail to be able to really understand and use them as indicators. Amphibians, again, amazingly meet that criterion over and over again, even in remote parts of Peru or India, other parts of the world, as well as North America. And of course, birds also. Talk about bird books on behavior and speciation and breeding atlases. It's amazing how much work we have available for this taxon of the birds. So they certainly meet that criterion as well. Lots of others do too, but you probably are surprised to understand that tiger beetles have got whole books written on their behavior, on their ecology, on their biology. And look at the number of field guides. There are field guides for Bolivia, for North America, for India, for Colombia, for Madagascar. Over and over again, we find out that this for some reason, and it's mainly because there's so many amateurs, so many citizen scientists out there working, we've gotten the data. So that's another clue coming up there. Professionals alone, professional biologists, can't do this. They need a lot of help. And we have whole websites, iNaturalist, whole websites on tiger beetles and birds and frogs that citizen scientists can contribute to, and do. Thousands contribute their ideas, their photographs, their distribution data throughout the year, so that we can have some groups of organisms that are extremely well known and can serve better as these types of surrogates as bioindicators. Here's an example of some of the data we can use. And again, a lot of this information has come not from professionals, but from private individuals. These are people working in IT, people who are engineers or dentists or lawyers. I've been working in India for the last 15 years. And I'm now interacting with over 3,000 Indians, mostly young people, who have extra time. And they take pictures of all these tiger beetles. And they post them on a website called iNaturalist. And we go over that. And they are now making a field guide that we published just 2 years ago obsolete in 2 years, because they now have so many more data. All they needed was a little direction, a little support. And it's amazing how much input these citizen scientists can have in helping us, not just with surrogates, but the other types of surrogate species as well. Professional scientists, especially those working in taxonomy and ecology and conservation, are never going to get this work done by themselves. There isn't the funding or the time. They cannot get it done by themselves. They need the help of lots and lots of citizen scientists. And I've been working with 3rd and 4th graders in Ecuador and Peru and India as well, who have also been doing a lot of help. So again, this is the kind of thing where you can actually point to your own students and show them that they can jump right in and be extremely important in broad conservation efforts that scientists around the world not only will use, but are eager to use. Here's an example of why tiger beetles are so useful. They occur around the world. There's several thousand species, but they tend to be fairly specialized wherever they occur. Here are 2 species in the state of Washington. They occur almost side by side, but the one species only occurs along the water. The other species occurs up away from the water. And we see that happening in the Amazon. We see that happening in India. We see that happening in Australia, where these tiger beetles have got behaviors that we can really get a handle on fairly quickly, get their ecology down, understand why they are, where they are, who their enemies are, what they eat, when they occur. Lots of details, again, coming from not only specialists, but actually the major part of the information comes from these amateurs, these non-professionals. Now, what about being easily observed and manipulated? Here's some other examples, just to give you an idea of which groups can be eliminated very quickly. They can be really well known in their taxonomy. We can know a lot about their behavior and things. But if it's so hard to see them, if it's so hard to observe them, hard to manipulate them, they lose their usefulness very, very quickly. And that's a real important part of choosing these surrogates. They have to be very, very useful. Now with birds, again, there's lots of ways. We have over here our mist nets. We use those, and bird banding. We have lots and lots of groups. If you have ever had any contact with birders, you know a lot of them now are using eBird, which has Cornell University has gotten it going, where amateurs report all of their observations, and they have got literally millions of observations coming in every year. Close to 1 billion observations in a year around the world. It's just absolutely amazing how much data is coming in so quickly and how well organized it is. eBird has got it so organized, you can go in there as a professional, you can go in there and you can gather the data that you need very, very quickly in a very organized way. It makes it very, very easy to finally get data. I remember what it was like 20 years ago, and I had to get all the data myself. It was really slow and tedious. Now with a little direction, we get I can ask for data and get it very, very quickly. So bird observations, very, very good. Frogs are a little bit harder. There's some other groups that have met the criteria for surrogates that we've talked about. But again, they're hard to manipulate. They're hard to deal with. Tiger beetle field experiments, again, zipping back to tiger beetles again, as I do over and over again, we can manipulate them. Here on the left, I have one student who is working on feeding experiments, trying to figure out why they eat, what they eat, when they can eat. In the middle, I have a student who is actually putting a tiger beetle on the end of a fishing pole and swishing in front of some of the predators, these robber flies, to see if we can measure exactly when robber flies attack, what they attack, what sizes, how the tiger beetles protect themselves. On the right, we had enclosures and exclosures to actually see the way that the tiger beetles were foraging, what they were eating. Very easy to manipulate them, very easy to understand very quickly what's going on. I've done a lot of work in the Amazon too with these kind of things. And this is another important part of choosing surrogate species, like these bioindicators. You have to have a group of organisms that are easily trainable by the investigators. And in more and more cases, we're dealing with untrained students, with untrained locals who are ready to help, but they have to be trained. So the ease of training field helpers, and also how dependable are the data once they begin to gather the data. Those are extremely important aspects. And those of you going down to the Amazon next summer, you're going to see this firsthand. Gathering data isn't always easy, and you need to choose which groups you're going to work with and how you're going to gather and what you're going to manipulate to get the data you need to make some decisions, to understand what's going on. Now, I've done this over and over again throughout Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, and Venezuela, and Colombia, and Panama, and Costa Rica, and India. I can take students who are not entomologists. They may be biologists, but they've never worked with insects in their lives before. And of course, don't even know a tiger beetle, never seen a tiger beetle before. Take them out on the paths, and within 5 hours of training, I can get them up to the point where they can identify 90% of the tiger beetles along the forest path. And they also can gather data very, very reliably. 5 hours of training. That's really important. I've done it with birds too. And guess what? To get the same level of expertise and reliability with people who don't know birds, we're talking about at least 5 to 10 months and maybe 1 to 2 to 3 years. So birds have met all the criteria, but when it comes down to actually gathering data, wow, it gets really hard. I've done bird community structures around the world in tropical rainforest. And for instance, I have seen predators attacking birds maybe 5 times in 50 years. Yet we know predators are very important. How do you gather data on the importance of predators if you never see it happening? With tiger beetles, we not only can observe it, we can do manipulations we can't do with birds. So again, these are all factors involved that are narrowing down the number of groups of organisms we can use as adequate surrogates as these bioindicators. And beyond that, again, this is a lot of work I've done in North America, Australia, and India. And when I go to a site, there are always only a few tiger beetle species, maybe at most in some of the tropical sites, 20 or 30 species. Yet it turns out we can find those 20 or 30 species probably within, at the right time of year, within 50 to 60 hours. we can find 90 to 95% of the species that are in the area. Why is that important? In such a short time, we can find out almost all the species of tiger beetles are there. And it turns out that the number of species of tiger beetles in all these different continental areas are correlated with the number of birds and butterflies. If I tried to work on the birds, it would take me 5 to 10 years to get the same data. With the butterflies, maybe 2 to 3 or 4 years to get the same amount of data. So I can project and predict just with a small number of tiger beetles, how many birds and how many butterflies are there. That's extremely important when you're short on time, short on funds, short on personnel. You can do a very, very effective way of looking at over large areas. So we've been able to survey across the Amazon looking at tiger beetles very, very quickly in a short amount of time. And from those data, we can also predict fairly accurately how many birds and butterflies and other groups of organisms will be in these same sites, all of which would have taken us many, many years otherwise. Again, here's one that a lot of conservationists don't like to talk about because it is very important, economic importance, but it also, in some ways, there is a feeling like if I am giving way to economics, if I'm looking at cost and benefits, automatically I'm going to be dealing with what we call ecological triage. Some species are worth more than other species. And that causes a lot of problems in people's minds. But that may well be what a lot of the future holds. And it's something we need to consider very, very carefully. What are the benefits and costs for ignoring economic importance? And again, as an example of how important this is, I can tell you what it was like in India. When I was working in India and working on tiger beetles, we'd approach some of the legislatures there about the importance of conservation. And we talk about tiger beetles, this glazed look came over their eyes. It was just like, oh, insects, bugs. I don't want to hear about that. But when I told them this story, they changed their mind immediately. We looked at rice paddies, and rice paddies in India are extremely important. In India, about 5 to 10% of the rice harvest is lost due to a plague of brown leaf hoppers. And this is how common they are. They get on the rice, up on the rice stems, and they chew away. They suck out the bits of the inside of the rice, and they can destroy a complete harvest in a very, very short amount of time. Turns out there is a tiger beetle, this one, that crawls up on the grass to eat the leaf hoppers. And we found out that we can attract more of this tiger beetle. We can increase the population of tiger beetles by 20 or 30 times by knowing its behavior. The six-spotted tiger beetle, the females prefer to lay their eggs in soil angled at 45 degrees. So what do? The dikes around the rice paddies, we all changed to 45 degrees. And it brought in, as I say, it doubled, tripled, quadrupled the population of tiger beetles there. And of course, they're not only ovipositing, they're eating leaf hoppers as well. When I told this story to these Indian legislatures, they changed their mind immediately about the importance of looking at tiger beetles, conservation, preservation. It was the secret of economics. It's something that we can no longer avoid. We're going to have to look more and more at economics. Again, keeping in mind the trade-off. Once you start looking at economics, some species are going to be more valuable than other species. Can we save them all? That's a question we have to think about. Can we save as many as possible? That's another way of looking at it. And these are ways that we're going to, philosophically, we're going to have to really talk about and understand what is important for the future. Can we look at biodiversity and say, well, we know what it was like 100 years ago. That's what we want to go back to. Is that going to be possible? With climate change, the world changing, the population of human beings the way they are, these are things we all need to take into consideration. Environment, conservation is no longer just for biologists. It needs to include city planners. It needs to include geologists, economists, sociologists, psychologists. It includes a whole breadth of knowledge and background if we're going to have conservation in the future. And it may well be that we're going to have to use a small number of species to really make the story sell, to really make the story go, and in doing so, save as many of the other species as possible. Here's some examples of indicator species. just to show you how they can help understand biodiversity in this broad point of view and direct conservation efforts. Here's a problem we've had. It's called detectability. How do you distinguish between a population or species that is rare and or in decline, or common but extremely difficult to observe or find? How many times have you heard the story about a species that we thought was extinct, and all of a sudden we find it's not extinct? 20 years later, it's not extinct after all. Or even, it's more common than we thought. Psychologically, that has a big impact on people's attitude towards conservation. If we cry wolf too many times, we are going to lose support. We have to make sure we understand, is that species really rare? Or is it just hard to find? And it's been something we've made mistakes on over and over again. And every time we make a mistake, it's ammunition for anti-conservationists to say, you guys don't know what you're talking about. That species was there all along. So this whole idea of detectability has become more and more important. By using and measuring detectability, we can avoid the subjective choice of threatened and endangered species. And believe you me, threatened and endangered species, these red lists, are highly subjective. If you look at lists of the IUCN, if you look at lists of different taxa, compare mollusks to birds to orchids, if you look at who claims something is an endangered species in England, and that same group of species, how it's declared being endangered in Brazil, they have very different categories, very different criteria. Endangered and threatened ends up having very different meanings depending on which taxon you're talking about and which country you're in. It's unbelievably subjective. And of course, that doesn't help our case very much. When you get people arguing against, I don't want this species conserved because economically it's going to impact me. And often it does impact people economically if you preserve a habitat and they no longer can cut the trees down, can no longer plant what they want to there. So this is not a trivial question. The subjectivity has to be taken out of declaring things to be threatened or endangered. It has to be absolutely correct with little room for error. It turns out that there are now mathematical models that we can measure mean detectability. And they can use species lists made by citizen scientists. And it's just, is it here or not here? Not even the numbers. If we just know in this year it was present, this year was absent, this year was at, we can actually put that together so that these species lists from ecotourist lodges, from other places, not even as sophisticated as eBird, we can actually measure and come up with a mathematical mean detectability that's a very, very rigorous number. Why is that important? Because now we know if we have well-studied endangered species we know are endangered or threatened, and we can measure their detectability level, we know this is a standard level that indicates somebody is threatened or detectable. When a detectability level reaches this number, it's threatened. When it reaches this number, it's endangered. We can then apply that to all species, no matter what taxon they are, no matter where they occur in the world. We have a quantitative measure of threatened and endangered that is objective, not subjective. And it makes our long-term efforts much, much more effective because we will be making fewer mistakes. So again, surrogate species serving our goals of making other species better protected. Here's another one. I worked with Terry Irwin from the Smithsonian for quite a few years, especially in Peru, in Madre de Dios in southern and central Peru. And what he was doing was fogging the crown of these single trees in the Amazon. And they do it with this fogging machine early in the morning before there's any wind. It's a short-lived, real short-lived, it has about a half hour life, pesticide. And it would rise up into the crown, and all the insects and spiders would be knocked out of the crown of the tree and fall onto these plastic sheets. From a single tree, we would get up to a kilo, 2.2 pounds of insects. Can you imagine 2.2 pounds of insects? And we're talking about up to 2,000 species from a single crown of a tree of insects, of which we maybe had names for 100. All the rest were unknown to science. We go to a different species of tree, just a few hundred meters away, do the same thing. We get another kilo of insects, 2,000 species, 80% of which weren't in the first tree. And from that, Terry was able to estimate that in the world, there are not 2 or 3 million species. There are closer to 20 to 30 million species, just extrapolating from all these species you're finding in these canopies of the trees in the Amazon. Now, most of those species that he collected are still in alcohol sitting in the Smithsonian Institution. There weren't experts to handle all those, to identify them, to give them names. So what he did is he took out the beetles that are the better known groups and used them as a way to extrapolate the number of other species as well as worldwide number of species. And you can understand how this number really impressed people, that by doing this, he increased by 10 or 20 times the estimated total number of species in the world. And perhaps 80% of those species in the world are still unknown to science, giving us an idea of how much is left yet to know out there. You talk about the ocean, you talk about other habitats, and we get even more species that we are almost certain are out there are still unknown to us. Biodiversity, for the most part, is a fog. We don't know what's going on because we haven't even seen most of these species yet. That's how incredible this is, this whole idea, and how fast these habitats and environments are going. We don't have the time or the luxury to sit around and say, well, we'll just take our time and go little by little. We have to jump in there, and surrogates, like groups of insects, groups of other organisms, are one real important way that we can handle this immense number of species and get some idea so we can communicate to the people who make decisions, this is what's going on. Conservation hotspots has been a popular and widely used method of prioritizing conservation areas around the world. It's been used for the last 20 years. It uses areas that have highest species diversity. There's significant endemism, that is, these species are not widespread, they only occur in a small little area. And also there's a major danger of destruction, that this is an endangered habitat. It's being logged, it's being destroyed, it's being cut down, it's being burned. And these have been used to prioritize funding and attention. We don't have the time to spend leisurely going to all these different areas, looking at them one by one. We have to prioritize which are the ones we need to really work with. Where do we need to invest our money and our time the most? And using conservation hotspots, although it's again controversial, it doesn't take some factors into account and has its limitations, has its cost as well. But the benefits have been very, very useful. Conservation hotspots. Just as an example, tiger beetles are being used more and more now because we know so much about them. And this is some of the work we've been doing in India, where we can look at the distribution of endemic tiger beetles. We can look at the overall distribution of species richness. We know which habitats are the most endangered, which are the most threatened habitats. And from that, by using just tiger beetles, they were able to look at and determine these are the most potential areas for the highest species richness, the most endemism, and the most endangered habitats that we need to prioritize. And we already know where you find more tiger beetles, you find more birds. Where you find more tiger beetles, you find more butterflies. So they can serve as a very, very important and very fast surrogate that we can get things done very, very quickly. So the question comes up, and I want you to really think about this. And this is one you can really, with this now, propose to your students. Get them thinking about this. These are not easy ones. They involve a lot of philosophical, economical, biological problems all together in one fell swoop. Do we have the time and money to save all these poorly known species without using surrogates? There are a lot of people say, oh no, I do not want to exclude species. I want to study every species. I don't want to just concentrate on one single species and have the chance to allow other species go extinct. Is that a luxury we can afford? Do we have the time for that? Think about that, understand it. And I hope you guys are going to have some really good comebacks on this and some ideas in a discussion. But I got one last question to ask you. Think about this. Which single species has the most impact in the world and is the most important surrogate to understand? Somebody tell me. Anybody got an idea in the chat? Or go ahead and undo your audio and let me know. Who's got an idea out there? Insects? Humans? Phil, thanks, tiger beetles. Well, let me give you some idea here. Who can do that in 6 months? Clear out 1,000 hectares in 6 months of forest, completely clear it out and replace it with a single species of plant, African oil palm. Who can do that and have plastic throughout the world? Who can do that and change the climate of the entire world? Desiccation, extreme hurricanes. Who are we talking about? Us. And this is finally the last thing. Can we continue to have the luxury of excluding ourselves as a species in the community of biodiversity? Are we part of biodiversity or are we not? Is Homo sapiens a natural species? I've talked about this before. When I'm with my friends in Thailand or with the Maya Huna or the Quichuas or the Kofans or other groups in South America, they have no problem seeing us as a member of a community of species and plants. We aren't special. The only thing that makes us special is we're so destructive. And we need to see ourselves as part of the problem, not a part of the problem. We're in the middle of this. And unless we can see ourselves and redefine natural to include us, we're going to have a real problem in actually passing the psychological barriers to do what we need to do. This is our habitat and we're part of it. So think about that too and understand that it seems kind of sophisticated, seems kind of subtle, but how do you define natural? That's extremely important. So I've asked a lot of questions. Now I want to hear some things from you. What do you think? Is this a good idea? Not a good idea. How can we improve it?
All right, everybody, unmute those mics and have at it. Ask your questions, make your comments. I've dropped a bunch of links in the chat, some links to Dave's work, as well as his stuff, teaching stuff, as well as his paper and some other things as well. So questions, comments, put them out there.
I know you're not shy.
I have a question, and it's not about cashews. Sorry about that earlier comment.
No
I got
worries.
hungry, okay.
We don't want cashews now, Nicole.
I mean, I love cashews, but I had no idea I was unmuted. I don't know how that happened. Sorry. I want to know your opinion on what you think will move the needle on biodiversity in terms of what will, sort of the intersection of economics, cultural, like what moves the needle on the populace in terms of buying into this?
Well, I'm a little cynical. What will not change it is a bunch of professors. Right here, we've got a joke that at most universities, the only way we get to change things is when old professors die or retire. I think the key is actually you people, the teachers. This is a long-term investment. We don't have a lot of time, but first, second, third, and fourth graders, that's where it's going to start. That's one part of it. Getting them, and more often than not, I've been involved with, especially third graders, in which we've talked about tropical rainforest and touching a rainforest and the products. And I've actually ended up having them teach their parents when they go to the grocery store, talking about where this stuff comes from. So you teachers have got amazing potential to have an impact on this through your students. I'm also finding now what's happening is that with young people in South America and India, many times when I started working there 50 or 60 years ago, the people I'm working with now, their parents could barely afford the food. They were struggling. Their kids are now in IT. They're buying cameras. They can afford to have vacations. They have hobbies. And what I found for them is giving them direction, giving them encouragement and support in actually going after biodiversity as citizen scientists. So I'd say those are the two areas, the kids you're teaching and these young people who are now coming up as in a new generation where all of a sudden they've got extra time, they've got the money, they only have 2 kids, and they're willing and able to use that extra time for a lot of things. With a little direction, a little encouragement, they can really help us get the data we need very quickly. So I say those are the 2 areas that are most important to me.
So Dave, I have a question. What's your take on the half Earth movement? In light of everything you've talked about tonight.
Well, why don't you define it for everybody so they all know what it is?
Well, I'll do my best because I haven't dug too deep into this, but basically it's coming out of E.O. Wilson's foundation, and it's the idea that preserving half of the Earth's surface in one way, shape, or form would go a long way to halting or stemming the loss of biodiversity.
With corridors, the corridors are real important in there too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's how can I say, there's a trade-off also of asking too much. I mean, if you ask too little, it's not going to work. But there's also a problem I have with that is if you're putting out there way too much and making it almost impossible. But what's impossible? It's a hard one to say. If we don't think big, we're going to end up with very little. So there are trade-offs there too. But if you ask for too much, people get turned off too and not going to support it. What I'm seeing right now is what's really working is smaller patches, if they can be connected with corridors, are extremely effective in keeping biodiversity as high as possible. You don't need in many cases to conserve and preserve millions of square kilometers of habitat. If you can have relatively smaller patches, but all of them connected with corridors, you can be very effective. But again, I'm saying it's not going to be like it was 100 years ago. It's never going to be like it was 100 years ago. Even if we save half the Earth, it's not going to be the same. And we are going to lose some things. And people don't like to hear that. But if we can reduce what we're going to lose as much as possible, I think that might be a very significant goal. Is it giving up? That's a whole nother question.
Thanks. We've got just a few more minutes left. So questions, anybody, comments, thoughts, request for more information? What's on your mind after this talk?
I'll ask one more quick question. You mentioned more than once during the conversation today that we don't have much time. I think you used that phrase several times. Can you extrapolate? Can you explain what you mean by that specifically?
When I go down to the Amazon, I have a real problem now because I look at what it's like now and I think about what it was like 60 years ago. And you see a forest that's looks beautiful, but there's no macaws, there's no howler monkeys, the crocodile or the caiman are all gone. In my lifetime, I've seen these pristine forests go from what they were like 800 years ago to something like I can't believe anymore. It's just the change has been so quick and fast. And I talk to people that are my age. David Attenborough said the same thing. We've all seen the same thing in habitats around the world. It has gone so fast, it makes our head swim. And the trouble with people today don't know what it was like 60 years ago. They see it as now as normal. And it's still going. It's still going very quickly. Climate change is happening faster than anybody. Climate change is not new. We knew in the 70s climate change was coming. It was predicted in the 70s. It's happened maybe 10 or 20 times faster than anybody's predicted. All the models got it wrong. It's happening faster. So when I say fast and quick, that's what I'm talking about. Things are going. We need to do things in response to preserve and conserve as much as we can very quickly, or otherwise it's going to be gone too.
Thanks, Dave. I want to circle back around just real quickly to how you sort of kicked this off. This idea of natural history and how much we don't know about species, and how, as educators, what we learned or what I learned as a child, just about what my own natural history of my own backyard, so much of that has been lost from the curriculum, and kids are spending less and less time outside. So there's less and less familiarity with even what's out there. And I think that's a real opportunity for us to re-engage young people back out in the world, and put them on a mission to improve things so that we don't spiral down into doom and gloom, because that's a real worry too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially with young people. It's hard enough for us as adults, but
I agree with you, Chris. The doom and gloom, I have to watch myself all the time. What I've found, especially from kindergarten and third graders, getting them out just outside the schoolhouse and looking at what's outside the schoolhouse, it's amazing how much interest they have. But for me, it's even more telling. You know what the question is, the third graders are always asking, why? When I talk to high schoolers, it's like a brick wall. Something's happened. They've stopped asking why. And I try and use enthusiasm, and it's like, it just bounces off them. It doesn't have any impact until I get them out in the field. When they get out in the field, we'll take them to a local park here or a water refuge, they turn into different people. So if you can, I really encourage, even if you can't get them down to the Amazon, get your kids out around the schoolyard. The schoolyard's got lots of things, or take field trips, local field trips. They turn into different people, especially the junior high school and high school kids really have an impact on them. I think that's probably the best way to show people. Urbanization, cities, there's a lot of future there. There's a lot of hope there that we can do things right. And again, the gloom and doom, I have to really be very, very careful because it's easy to slip into that. And that doesn't do anybody any good. That's not going to encourage people to keep trying to protect what we do have or are going to have.
All right, I think that will just about wrap us up. I'm going to drop in the chat here real quickly a link to sign up for our newsletters. If you are not on our email list, this is a good way to keep up to date on upcoming webinars. We offer these once a month, except for the summer when we're down in the Amazon. In December, we're going to have Christy Reddick and Jess Honecker, also known as the Bug Chicks, on. They're doing some amazing work as entomologists, but also around social emotional learning. So if you've not signed up and aren't getting our emails, please do so. And Dave, so much gratitude. Thank you for this wonderful evening of information. And it's always a pleasure. And we are counting on getting you back down there in the Amazon for us. I've got all kinds of ideas for tiger beetle studies now. So thank you for planting that seed. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Okay, dígame cuando quieres. Nos vemos. Chao, chao.
Thanks so much. Night, everybody.